Our next speaker is Dr. Don Shields. Dr. Shields is a graduate of the University of Utah School of Medicine, class of 1971, and is the 2011 recipient of the University of Utah School of Medicine Distinguished Alumni Award. He completed a neurology residency and Pediatric Neurology Fellowship at the U, and has been at the David Geffen School of Medicine at UCLA since that time. He served as Chief of Child Neurology for 25 years at UCLA and led the development of the UCLA Pediatric Epilepsy Program that pioneered surgical treatments of epilepsy in very young children, among other advances in epilepsy management. Tonight, he will share how his passion for treating children with severe epilepsy brought about some unexpected good fortune. Please welcome Dr. Don Shields.
Thank you. Okay, so Pat, I'm going to tell you the story of how the Patrick Bray Presidential Endowed Chair came to be. It began when a colleague and I were talking about care of some and resulted in what I called a positive manifestation of the law of unintended consequences. Now, this is what we usually think about when somebody says unintended consequences, right? This guy probably was not planning to have an accident that day. It was not in his mind. But,
we can't hear you back here.
uh-oh. Is that better?
Yes, thank you.
Uh-oh, okay. I'll try to crank it up. Okay, so we were talking about this guy. I don't think he intended to have an accident that day, but when you look at this, you say, if you're stupid enough to do this very often, you're going to have an accident sometime, right? But accidents are not always bad. Sometimes outcomes are quite surprising. So one day a man was working and walked into a river, waded into the river, and a bright object captured his attention. He picked it up, looked around, found a few more, and pretty soon he had a handful of gold nuggets with an unintended consequence of setting off the California gold rush. Some people might not think that's a positive consequence, but it had huge influence on the United States and on California and even on Salt Lake, because this was a point along the way where people could get supplies on their way to the gold fields. So it had a huge influence. So sometimes things are positive. As physicians, we often are making consequential decisions. We do it every day. Sometimes we make these decisions and we have an expected outcome. Sometimes we have a hoped-for outcome. Sometimes a surprising outcome, and maybe once in a while something totally amazing and wonderful happens. I spent the summer of my freshman year doing a research project with Pat Bray. And he inspired me to become a child neurologist, something that I will be forever grateful for, because I loved to be a child neurologist. I just really have enjoyed what I have done. I trained with Pat, and when I'd completed my training, he was instrumental in getting me a position at UCLA, where I was able to establish the UCLA Pediatric Epilepsy Program. And the mission statement of the program, and my personal mission statement, was to improve the lives of the unfortunate children afflicted with catastrophic epilepsy. So you need to focus on that catastrophic epilepsy part, something really different there. One of the interesting things about pediatric epilepsy is there's a great variety in the kinds of syndromes that we deal with, a lot more than in adults, and a big variety in the outcome of the patients. For example, febrile seizures are really common. This number of people in the room, it is almost certain that there are some people in here who had febrile seizures as a child, or who have children with febrile seizures. It's really common. If you've ever seen a child have a convulsion, you know how frightening it can be. Other than scaring the life out of the patients, though, ordinary febrile seizure has no long-term consequence for the child. They do just fine. But at the other end of the spectrum are those catastrophic epilepsies. And the hallmark catastrophic epilepsy is infantile spasms. It doesn't look the same as other seizures. The typical spasm is just a little flexion jerk, kind of like what the picture shows. Sometimes they're very subtle. Sometimes they're a lot stronger. Sometimes the child will jerk and cry with it, go, ah, ah. They're not rhythmic. And sometimes they're so subtle, they're just a little head nod. If they're laying down, you don't even see it. If they're sitting up, you'd see it. Because of the unusual nature and the rarity of the disease, the diagnosis is often missed for weeks or months. That is really unfortunate because we know that if we can get that child treated within 2 to 3 weeks of the onset of the spasms with an effective medication, the probability of a more normal developmental outcome is greatly improved. The only treatment, though, that's been effective is something we've been using since the mid-50s, and that's very high-dose steroids. That's a hard treatment on a little kid. They become extremely irritable. I mean, the parents are distraught over how difficult the kids are. They get a ravenous appetite, they gain weight, they get the moon face, they get immunosuppressed with occasional terrible consequences. So it's pretty clear that we needed new therapies for this disorder. Our standard anticonvulsants just don't do much. So let's get back to our story. Roy Elterman, a colleague from Texas, and I were examiners at the oral board exams for neurology. And we had an hour break, and we were just talking one day. And I asked Roy, did you see that paper from Catherine Sharon in Paris that said vigabatrin works in infantile spasms? This is vigabatrin. See, I saw that. That was really interesting. We talked a little bit more, and he said, Don, I wonder if Aventis, who owned the drug, would give us some drugs so that we could do a compassionate use protocol. We talked some more. We knew that we would have colleagues who would love to do it. So we thought, okay, we'll try for a national collaborative compassionate use protocol. Well, why don't we have it now? It had been started, treatment in the US. They were doing the trials in adults with complex partial epilepsy about a decade before. Then a little problem came up. Experimental animals, rats and dogs, showed fluid changes or white matter changes with fluid collections called intramyelinic edema. And the FDA said, okay, that's the end. We are not going to be doing that drug in the United States. But there was no evidence that it occurred in humans. So Europe continued to develop the drug. And it was approved so that the folks in France had it. And in fact, the people in Canada had it, and the people in Mexico had it. I mean, it was all over the place. Everybody had it but us. That didn't seem right. Roy and I decided, okay, let's see if Aventis will give us the drug. So we have a few hurdles to clear here. First one's Aventis. So we make this proposal to Aventis, and they say quite emphatically no. They were going to try to get approval for the drug. That 10 years they thought was long enough, and the FDA might approve it now for complex partial seizures. And I think they were afraid that if something went wrong with our kids, they wouldn't get the approval. So no. But Roy and I are both nothing if we're not persistent, and we pestered them. And it turned out that we had a friend in the company, and eventually said, okay, we'll give you the drug. But the new drug application that we have from the FDA, you can't use it. You have to get your own NDA. But they were pretty generous with us. They gave us a big barrel with 65,000 vigabatrin pills in it. So I think they thought we were going to use a lot of it, and we did. and a modest amount of money so we could do that study. So we cleared that first hurdle. We're over it. Next hurdle, let's go to the FDA. I fill out the NDA application and submit it. 3 weeks later, a letter comes from Rusty Katz in the neuro division that says, no, you have to do a double-blind placebo-controlled study. We're not going to approve you for compassionate use. Well, that's a bit of a problem. We don't have placebo. Aventis made it very clear that when they gave us the drug and that little bit of money, that we're done. This is now an investigator program, not theirs. So don't come back to us. So we're not going to get placebo, and we don't have enough money to set up a placebo system. So Roy and I got on a plane. We flew to DC and met with the folks at the FDA and explained the problem. And they said, okay, come back with something that you think maybe we can approve. So we did a little more work. We came back with a high-dose, low-dose protocol. And they said, okay, we'll approve it. We're over the hurdle. We start the drug going. And that's great. We're really happy with that. And our patients are doing quite well. This is the only drug study I've ever done, and I've done a bunch of them, where doctors were calling and asking me if I could get their patients into the study. It was well known out there that this was something that might work for spasms. Eventually, we enrolled 250 patients, but you kind of get the feeling that maybe things keep happening that aren't going to quite work out right. We're going along quite well. We'd actually published a preliminary report, and then something comes up that doesn't look like a hurdle anymore. This looks like some insurmountable thing, like L-Capitan. I'm not going to get over L-Capitan. Maybe some of you guys can, but I can't. Because people in Europe were now being reported to have developed a visual field defect. And Aventis said, okay, we're not going to make a submission. We're just not even going to try. And we have no plans to do it in the future. Then, in 2000, we had this big barrel of pills, right? Well, probably 2/3 gone by that time. But it had an expiration date in 2000. And you tell me a research pharmacy that's going to let you dispense expired drugs. So we're done. We can't give it to our patients anymore. That was really upsetting, and also knowing that we were not going to be able to get it approved was, you know, it was really, both of us were really unhappy. But then a small startup company bought the rights. We talked to them about this, and they bought the rights in North America and said, we're going to try to do it. And they reviewed all the stuff that Aventis gave them, and then came to us and said, you know, we don't think this is going to get approved with the data Aventis has. We need your data to get this drug approved. Great, thrilled. Here's the data, take it, do it. They said, no, we have a better idea. We would like to give you a percentage of sales of this drug so that you can do research in pediatric epilepsy. That's even better. I mean, how good can it get, right? So Roy and I set up the Pediatric Epilepsy Research Foundation and waited for approval of the drug. You know, they were going along, it was about ready to go in. But, you know, can you predict that there's going to be another problem because we keep running into them? Remember when I told you that the white matter changes occurred in dogs and rats, but not humans? Well, whoops, that's the insurmountable object becoming over. Well, then the report came from a colleague in Washington, D.C., that MRI changes on the patients with infantile spasms being treated with vigabatrin showed changes consistent with intramyelinic edema. FDA says, okay, don't submit now. We need to get all the data that you have on that. So we'd gotten past the peripheral field issue with them, and now we have to deal with this intramyelinic edema issue. So it took several more months. We put it all together. We helped this small company get it done and get it submitted to the FDA, and it was approved in 2009. A great outcome. I can't tell you how happy we were to have that drug out on the market. This is the board of directors of the Pediatric Epilepsy Research Foundation. This foundation, in my mind, is that positive manifestation of an unintended consequence. You know, this was just two guys talking about a way to treat our patients with difficult to control epilepsy. And 15 years later, and a whole bunch of little hurdles to clear, we have a foundation that supports research in an area that both of us are very much involved with. So we were thrilled that that happened. In the 7 years since the drug was approved, we have funded 17 competitive research grants and 12 other meritorious projects. One of those meritorious projects is the Pediatric Bray, or Pediatric, that's good for that one, Patrick Bray Presidential Endowed Chair. And I can't tell you how happy I am that happened. I'd wanted for years to find a way to be able to honor Pat for all the work that he did and for guiding me into this field and then helping me through the training so that I could become a child neurologist, because I really loved it. So I am so happy that this opportunity came up and I was able to do that. This is the second unintended consequence of that time. Thank you very much.